"Could you save my twin little sisters?" Little Boy asked. What the cowboy did next stunned everyone. The road into Mercy Crossing was nothing but cracked dirt and dry heat. Thomas Wren rode in just past noon, his horse moving slow and steady beneath him. The animal was tired. So was the man. Both of them had seen too many empty miles in too many empty weeks, and neither one had much left to say about it. Thomas sat straight in the saddle out of habit, not pride. His shoulders carried the shape of a man who had once worn a uniform, though he had long since traded it for plain work clothes worn thin at the elbows. A bedroll was tied behind the saddle. A rifle rested across his lap. His boots were cracked at the toe, and the brim of his hat was bent low over a face that the years had not been kind to. He was 42 years old. He looked like a man who had lived every one of those years twice. The main street of Mercy Crossing was quiet in the wrong kind of way. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning. More like the kind of quiet that settles over a town after something has gone wrong and nobody knows what to say. A few men stood on the boardwalk outside the hardware store, speaking low. A woman hurried past with her head down, a basket pressed tight against her side. Two children sat on a porch step and watched Thomas ride by without making a sound. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He noticed all of it. Old habits from the war made him notice things like that. He tied his horse to the post outside the general store and stepped up onto the boardwalk. The sign above the door read, "Braddock's Goods and Sundry." A little bell rang when he pushed it open. The man behind the counter was broad and red-faced, stacking tins with more force than the job required. He glanced at Thomas the way a man glances at weather he does not trust. "Help you?" he said, not warmly. "Looking for day work," Thomas said. "Any ranches nearby needing an extra hand? I can drive a team, mend fence, handle horses. Just need enough for a meal and feed for my animal." The man set down a tin and looked at Thomas more carefully this time. His eyes moved over the scar that ran from Thomas's jaw down the left side of his neck. Then over the way Thomas stood, with his weight shifted slightly to the right, favoring a rib that had never healed quite straight. "Try the Garfield place, 2 miles east," the man said finally. "Though I can't promise you anything. Town's had its mind on other things lately." "That's so," Thomas said. It was not really a question. The man's expression shifted. Something between sadness and discomfort moved across his face. "Margaret Harper passed 3 weeks ago. Ran the freight line here. Good woman. Left behind 3 little ones." He picked up another tin. "Her brother-in-law came riding in before she was barely in the ground. Amos Harper. Man talks like he's doing everybody a favor, but his eyes say different." Thomas did not ask more. It was not his business. He thanked the man, stepped back out into the sun, and walked his horse around to the side of the building, where a watering trough sat in the shade behind the store. He let the horse drink. He stood beside it and rolled the stiffness out of his shoulders and looked at nothing in particular. Just a man and a tired horse and the sound of water. That was when he heard it. Soft at first. Easy to miss if you were not paying attention. A small, tight sound, like someone pressing their mouth shut against something that was trying to get out. Thomas went still. He heard it again, coming from behind the far end of the building, near the big wooden rain barrel that sat against the back wall. He walked toward it slowly. He came around the corner and stopped. A boy sat on the ground beside the barrel with his knees pulled up to his chest. He could not have been more than 11. His face was dirty and streaked from crying, and he was clutching a folded piece of paper so hard his knuckles had gone white. He was trying not to make noise. He was failing. The boy heard Thomas's boots and looked up fast, startled and scared. His eyes were red. His chin was trembling. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the boy looked at Thomas the way a drowning person looks at a piece of driftwood, like he had no business hoping but could not help it. "Mister," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "Could you save my twin little sisters?" Thomas crouched down beside the boy. His knees popped when he did it, the way they always did these days, and he rested his forearms on his thighs and looked at the child straight on, not down at him. Even with him. "What is your name, son?" he asked. "Ben," the boy said. "Ben Harper." Thomas studied his face. The boy was not exaggerating his distress. There was no performance in those red eyes, just exhaustion and fear, and the particular kind of grief that only comes from trying to hold something together for too long. "Tell me what happened, Ben." The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve. He took a shaky breath. Then the words came out in a rush, like he had been holding them behind a dam, and it had finally broken. "Mama died 3 weeks ago. She got sick real fast, and then she was just gone. And Uncle Amos came, and he said he was going to take care of us." Ben's jaw tightened. But he didn't mean take care of us. He meant take care of everything Mama built. Her wagons, her roots, the ranch. He means to have all of it. "And your sisters," Thomas said quietly. "Rosie and Ruth. They're 6. Twins." Ben's voice fractured on the word twins. He steadied himself. "He took them this morning and locked them up in the old freight office. He told me I'm old enough to hire out, that he'd find me work on a ranch somewhere. He said the girls are too much trouble, and he knows a preacher who can take them east to a children's home before sundown." Thomas felt the words land like stones dropped into still water. He did not let his face show what he felt, but something cold moved through him. "By sundown," he repeated. "Yes, sir." Thomas looked away for a moment. He looked at the back wall of the general store, at the peeling paint and the old nail heads rusted orange with age. He looked at his horse, still drinking at the trough, unbothered and patient. He thought about the Garfield place 2 miles east. He thought about the meal he needed, and the miles still ahead of him, and the very simple fact that he was a stranger in this town, with no name worth mentioning, and no standing whatsoever to walk up to a blood relative and say a word against him. He had no authority here. He had no history here. He was nobody. He started to push himself up from his crouch. That was when Ben thrust the folded paper forward. "Please," Ben said, "just look at it first. Mama said a Bible page remembers what men try to forget." Thomas looked at the paper in the boy's outstretched hand. It was worn soft at the folds, like it had been opened and closed many times. He took it. He unfolded it carefully. It was a page torn from a family Bible, the kind of page kept at the front, where births and deaths and important facts were written down in careful ink to outlast the people who made them. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the letters shaped by a woman who took her words seriously. It listed 3 children: Benjamin Thomas Harper, Rosie May Harper, Ruth Ann Harper, birth dates, the father's name. And beneath it all, written in the same careful hand, a statement that Margaret Harper, being of sound mind, declared all 3 children equal heirs to the Harper wagon freight business, including both freight teams, all established routes, and the ranch property north of town, to be held in trust until Benjamin came of age. Thomas read it twice. The handwriting did something to him he was not prepared for. It was just ink on paper. But behind it, he could feel the shape of a woman who had known something bad was coming and had tried her best to leave the truth somewhere it could not be buried. He had seen that before. He had seen it in letters carried by boys who did not come home, boys who had been somebody's younger brothers, somebody's sons, boys he had not been able to bring back. His hand tightened around the page. He folded it once, twice, and he tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his chest. He looked at Ben. "Show me where they took your sisters," he said. Thomas stepped out of the alley and onto the main street of Mercy Crossing without hesitating. He did not sneak. He did not hug the shadows or cut through backlots. He walked straight out into the open, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step, and Ben stayed right beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched. The street was not busy, but it was not empty either. A woman in a faded yellow dress swept her porch and stopped sweeping when she saw them. Two men leaning against the post outside the barber shop went quiet and watched. A boy about Ben's age froze in the middle of crossing the street, looked at them, then looked quickly away and hurried off. Thomas kept his pace easy and steady. Not rushed, not aggressive, just a man walking a street. But he felt the eyes. He had spent enough years reading a room, and a street was just a bigger room. He could feel the tension in this town the way you feel a storm before it arrives. Something had been sitting heavy over Mercy Crossing for a while now. The kind of heavy that comes when people are afraid of one man and do not know how to talk about it out loud. Ben noticed the stares too. The boy stayed half a step behind Thomas's shoulder, not hiding exactly, but not advertising himself either. They stopped at the dry goods store first. Thomas asked the man behind the counter a simple question about where freight deliveries usually came through. The man gave him a careful answer about the old Harper freight office down the street, then found something very important to do at the far end of the counter. They tried the woman outside the post office. She glanced at Ben, and her eyes went soft with recognition, and what might have been guilt. She said she was sorry about his mother. Then, she said she really could not say anything else, and went inside. An older man, sitting on a bench outside the feed store, looked at Thomas for a long moment. He chewed on something, and shifted, and finally said, "That Amos Harper is not a man you want to cross, friend." He said it quietly, like the words themselves might carry. Then he looked away down the street and said nothing more. Thomas nodded at him politely and moved on. Several people, when they thought nobody was watching, let their eyes drift toward the far end of the street, toward a squat building with shuttered windows and a faded painted sign above the door that had once read, "Harper Family Freight." Each time, the glance was quick, like looking at a fire you were not supposed to notice. Thomas noted the building. He noted the direction of every careful gaze. He steered them toward the livery stable. The livery sat just off the main street, set back slightly behind a split-rail fence. It smelled of hay and horses, and the particular warmth of animals kept close together. A wiry old man, with white stubble and sun-darkened skin, was working a harness near the entrance, his fingers moving through the leather with the slow confidence of someone who had done the same job for 30 years. He looked up when Thomas approached. His eyes moved from Thomas to Ben, and something shifted in his expression. A recognition followed quickly by caution. Thomas introduced himself simply. His name, that he was passing through, that he was looking for some information. The old man said his name was Gideon Pratt. He said it without warmth, but without hostility either. Thomas asked about the freight office. He kept his voice even, and his manner plain. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the harness. He worked a buckle with his thumb. Then, he let out a long breath through his nose. "The two little girls are in the back room of that freight office," Gideon said, keeping his voice low. "Been there since this morning. Amos is waiting on a preacher coming through. Man's supposed to sign some guardianship papers and take the girls east before evening." He paused, his mouth pressed flat. "Amos is telling everybody Margaret died, owing more debt than that freight business was worth. Says there is nothing left for those children to inherit. Says he is doing right by them finding them a home." Thomas looked across the dusty street toward the shuttered freight office. The sun had already crossed the midpoint of the sky. Thomas looked at the freight office for one more moment. Then he turned to Ben. "Stay close," he said. "Do not run ahead of me. Whatever happens, you stay at my side." Ben nodded. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were bright with something that was equal parts fear and fierce determination. For 11 years old, it was a remarkable thing to see. They crossed the street together. The sign above the freight office door had once read, "Harper Family Freight," in bold black lettering. Someone had taken a blade or a rough tool to the word Harper. It was not fully gone. The letters were still faintly visible beneath the scraping, like a scar that had not quite healed over. Margaret Harper's name, her family's name, scratched at and roughed up, but still stubbornly present. Thomas noticed it. He did not say anything about it. Two men stood near the front of the building. They were leaning against the wall to the left of the door, and they each held a cigarette, but neither one was actually smoking in any relaxed or idle way. Their eyes came up the moment Thomas and Ben stepped off the far side of the street, and those eyes did not move away again. One man was broad across the shoulders with a hat pulled low. The other was thinner and younger, with the kind of restless energy that tends to mean trouble is never far off. They were not subtle about their watching. That was the point. The watching was meant to be felt. Thomas kept his hands visible and easy at his sides. He did not reach for the rifle slung across his back. He did not touch the old pistol at his hip. He simply walked toward the door at an unhurried pace, and when the two men straightened slightly and shifted to put themselves in the path between him and the entrance, Thomas stopped. He looked at the broader man first, then the younger one, then back. He placed himself directly in front of Ben without making a show of it. One small step to the right, his body angled just enough that he was the first thing anyone would have to go through to reach the boy. "I want to see the two little girls inside," Thomas said. His voice was calm and flat. "Before any papers get signed. Before any man with a collar shows up and puts his name to anything. I want to see them." The broad man smiled in a way that had nothing friendly in it. "Ain't your business, friend." "I am making it my business," Thomas said. The younger one shifted his weight. His hand drifted an inch toward his belt. Thomas looked at him. Just looked. The way a man looks when he has already thought through every possible next move and is not afraid of any of them. The younger man's hand stopped moving. Nobody spoke for a moment. The street behind them was quiet. The sun pressed down hard on the dust and the boards. Then from somewhere behind the closed inner door of the freight office, faint and muffled but unmistakable, came the sound of a child crying. It was soft. The kind of soft that meant whoever was crying had been at it long enough to run out of loud. Thomas did not look away from the two men, but beside him, Ben went rigid. "Rosie," Ben said. The word came out barely above a whisper. He stepped forward and raised his voice. "Rosie, Ruth, it is Ben. I am right here." A half-second of silence. Then from behind the door came two voices at once, tangled together and urgent and raw with relief. "Ben! Ben! Ben! We are here!" Thomas was already moving. He stepped past the hired men, who pulled back just enough and pushed through the front door of the freight office. The room inside was dim, cluttered with empty crates and coils of rope. The inner door was shut and held by a simple drop lock, the kind used on storerooms and feed closets. Thomas pulled a freight hook from a peg on the wall. One firm strike, and the lock gave way. The door swung open. The room behind it was small and close, and smelled of dust and old wood. A single lantern sat on the floor, its flame turned low. Between the lantern and the far wall, Rosie and Ruth Harper sat pressed together on a folded horse blanket. A small crust of bread lay on the floor between them. Ruth had her arms wrapped around a cloth doll. Rosie had her arms wrapped around Ruth. Both girls had been crying. Their cheeks were streaked, and their eyes were red, and their hair was loose and tangled. Ben crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to his knees, and pulled them both into his arms, and the three of them held on to one another with the desperate grip of children who had been afraid they would not get to do that again. Thomas stood in the doorway. He held the freight hook in one hand and said nothing. He just watched the three of them, and something old and quiet moved through his chest. After a moment, Rosie lifted her face from Ben's shoulder. She looked at Thomas. Her eyes were still wet, her nose still red from crying. She studied him for a long moment with the open, unguarded way that only very young children look at strangers. "Are you the cowboy Mama sent?" she asked. Rosie's question hung in the small, dusty room like smoke. Thomas did not answer right away. He did not know how to answer it. He set the freight hook down against the wall and crouched low so he was closer to the children's level. "I am just a man who heard your brother," he said finally. "That is all." Rosie looked at him for another moment with those wide, serious eyes. Then she nodded, as if that was good enough for now. Ruth had not spoken yet. She held her cloth doll tight against her chest and watched Thomas from behind Ben's arm. She was the quieter one, that much was already plain. But her eyes were sharp and careful in a way that made Thomas feel like she was reading something in him that he could not read in himself. Ben helped both girls to their feet. Rosie stood and brushed at her skirt with the automatic dignity of a child trying to look brave. Ruth stood close enough to Ben that their shoulders touched. Thomas straightened and looked back toward the open front door. That was when Abigail Bell came through it. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-40s, wearing a work apron over a plain brown dress. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and she had clearly come directly from her shop across the way, because she still held a length of cream-colored thread looped around 2 fingers. She stopped just inside the door and took in the room in one sweeping look. Her eyes landed on the lantern on the floor, the horse blanket, the crust of bread. Her mouth pressed into a thin, tight line. "Oh, those poor babies," she said quietly. She moved to the twins without hesitating and crouched down in front of them. She touched Rosie's tangled hair gently and then cupped Ruth's small face in one hand. "You are all right now," she said. "You are all right." Miss Lydia Crane arrived at the door not 30 seconds later. She was younger than Abigail, straight-backed and composed, with ink on her right hand, and the look of a woman who had been in the middle of something and dropped it the moment she understood what was happening. She looked at the back room, at the blanket on the floor, at the single lantern. "They were locked in here," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Thomas said. Miss Lydia's composure did not crack, but something behind her eyes sharpened like a blade being drawn. She knelt beside Abigail and began speaking softly to the twins. Abigail unwound the long shawl she wore around her shoulders and draped it over both girls at once, pulling them close. Thomas turned back toward the door because the light in it had changed. A shadow filled the frame. Amos Harper was not a large man, but he carried himself like one. He was well dressed for a frontier town, with a dark vest and a watch chain and boots that had been recently cleaned. His face was even and controlled, the kind of face that had practiced looking reasonable for a long time. He stepped inside and looked around the room slowly, and when his eyes reached Thomas, they stayed there. Behind Amos came a second man. He wore a black coat and a white clerical collar and carried a leather satchel in one hand. He was somewhere between 40 and 50, with oiled hair and a broad smile that arrived on his face a half-second too late, like a man who had to remember to put it there. "Reverend Silas Bellwether," Amos said, gesturing to the man beside him. "Sent up from Caldwell County to arrange proper Christian homes for these girls." He looked at Thomas the way a man looks at something tracked in on a boot. "Whatever you think you are doing here, stranger, this is a private family matter. You have no standing in it." Thomas said nothing. He was watching the Reverend. The man smiled again and glanced briefly toward Amos. It was a small glance, fast and automatic, the kind a man makes when he wants to check that the person paying him is still satisfied. Then he looked back at Thomas, and the smile held. Thomas looked at the man's hands. The palms were soft, not the hands of a man who dug graves, carried hymnals through hard weather, or built anything with his life. The knuckles were smooth in the way that comes from hours at a card table, not hours of honest labor. There was a faint ridge along the inside of the right middle finger, worn into the skin from years of holding and flicking cards. Thomas breathed in quietly through his nose. Beneath the sharp, clean bite of peppermint, there was something else. Faint, but there. Whiskey. The so-called Reverend clasped his hands in front of him and turned his smile toward the twins. These little ones have nothing to fear. We will see them placed in godly homes, where they will be well cared for and loved. Rosie pressed herself back against Abigail. Ruth did not move at all, but her arms tightened around her doll. Thomas stepped forward, not toward Amos, toward the Reverend. Before anything else happens, Thomas said evenly, these little girls are scared half out of their senses. They have been locked in a back room all afternoon with nothing but a candle and a piece of bread. He kept his voice easy and civil. A man of God ought to have something to offer them before he starts talking about arrangements. A simple blessing, something to ease their hearts. Amos started to speak. Thomas did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the Reverend. You would do that for them, wouldn't you? A short blessing. The Lord's Prayer, maybe. The Reverend's smile stayed in place, but the muscles around his eyes tightened. He looked at Amos again. Another quick flicker, fast as a card flip. Then he cleared his throat and turned to the girls and folded his hands. Our Father, he began, who art in heaven. A pause, a beat too long. Hallowed be thy kingdom. Another pause. His jaw shifted slightly. Thy will be done, on earth as we would have it. Ruth's eyes moved up from her doll and found his face. Give us this bread, the Reverend continued, his voice dropping lower and picking up speed the way a man talks when he is hoping speed will cover up the gaps. And forgive us our sins as we forgive those who owe us. He trailed off. The room was quiet. Ben stared at him. Abigail's hand had gone still in Rosie's hair. Miss Lydia had risen slowly to her feet. The Reverend attempted a smile and tried again. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from... He stopped. His eyes moved to the doorway and back. Ruth looked up at him with those still, careful eyes, and asked in her small, quiet voice, Is God mad at us? Something crossed the Reverend's face that was not comfort and was not holy. He drew a sharp breath, shifted his weight, and said under his breath in a tone that had nothing of a church in it at all, Oh, for the love of... The words were quiet, but the room was quieter. A small rectangle of pasteboard slipped from his left sleeve and fell to the floor between his feet. It landed face up. It was a playing card with a faint pencil marking along one edge. Thomas reached down and picked it up. He looked at it. Then he looked at the man in the black coat. He reached up and unclipped the white clerical collar from the man's shirt in one steady motion. Lyle Griggs, Thomas said, I have seen your type at enough gaming tables to recognize the calluses. He held up the card and the collar together, one in each hand, so that everyone in the room could see both clearly. This man is not a preacher. He is a traveling gambler, and somebody paid him to dress the part. The collar and the card hung in Thomas's hands for just a moment. Then the room broke open. The men crowding the doorway had been quiet up until then, watching with the careful stillness of people who did not want to be noticed. Now voices rose all at once. Gideon Pratt pushed through from the back of the small crowd and pointed at Lyle Griggs with a thick finger. A woman near the door said Margaret Harper's name, like it was something sacred. Two men, who had been standing on Amos's side of the room, took a slow, half-step away from him, without seeming to realize they had done it. Lyle Griggs snatched his collar back from Thomas's hand and stuffed it into his coat pocket. His face had gone red, and he was already moving toward the door, muttering something that no one could fully hear. The crowd parted, just enough to let him feel the shame of walking through it. Abigail was already on her knees beside the twins. She unwound her second shawl, the heavy wool one she kept folded over her arm in the evenings, and wrapped it around Rosie first, tucking it snug. Rosie pressed her face into Abigail's shoulder and let out the kind of cry that had been held too long. Ruth stood still and let Abigail draw her in too. Both girls bundled against the older woman's sides like birds caught in a sudden storm. Miss Lydia stepped to the center of the room. "Margaret Harper told me herself," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it had the kind of weight that makes a room go quiet on its own. "She sat right there in my schoolroom, not 3 months before she passed, and she said her children were to be raised together, all 3 of them. Together." She looked directly at Amos. "She never wrote anything, said anything, or signed anything that meant otherwise." Amos had not moved from his spot near the door. His expression had not changed much either. He was watching the room the way a man watches a fire, deciding whether it is going to spread or burn itself out. Ben had both arms around his sisters. He looked up at Thomas with something in his eyes that was so much older than 11 years, it was hard to look at directly. "You saved them," he said. It was barely above a whisper. Thomas did not answer. He was still watching Amos. The crowd pressed closer. Someone said the word sheriff. Someone else said the word fraud. The outrage was real and rising, and for a few minutes it felt like the town of Mercy Crossing had found something it had been missing, a line it was willing to stand behind. Then Amos moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He simply turned and walked out the front door of the freight office at an even pace, like a man who had somewhere more important to be. The crowd let him through, because crowds usually do. He was gone for less than 10 minutes. When he came back, he brought 3 men with him. They were not dressed for church. They stood at the doorway and said nothing, but their presence changed the air in the room, the way a cold wind changes an open field. Amos stood in front of them and looked at Thomas. "This man," he said to the room, loud enough for the street to hear through the open door, "is Thomas Wren, former soldier." He let that sit for a breath. "Deserter. He abandoned his post during active service and has been drifting ever since, hiring out under different names and moving on before anyone can look too close." He reached into his vest and produced a folded piece of paper. "I had this sent up from the county office when I heard a stranger was stirring trouble in my family's business." He held it open. It was an old military document, worn at the folds and darkened at the edges. Thomas's name was printed clearly near the top. Sheriff Calder Pike had appeared in the doorway at some point during all of it. He looked at the paper. Then he looked at Thomas. Thomas had gone very still. The document was real. He recognized the letterhead, the format, the particular way the Army printed names. He also knew what it did not say, but the town did not know that. The town only saw his name on an official paper that Amos was holding up like proof. The voices in the room dropped away one by one until the silence was nearly complete. The evening light came through the freight office's single window at a low angle, cutting across the dusty floor in a long, pale stripe. It lit up the motes floating in the air and made the room look like something out of an old painting, the kind where nobody was smiling. Amos tucked the military paper back into his vest pocket with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate, like a man putting away a tool he expected to use again shortly. "Sheriff," he said without looking at Pike. "Do your job." Pike stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He turned the brim once around, then stopped. His eyes moved from Amos to Thomas, to the children pressed against Abigail's sides, and then back to the paper that had just disappeared into Amos's pocket. His jaw tightened. "Mr. Wren," Pike said quietly, "I think it would be best if you stepped outside." The words landed flat. Not mean, just tired. The voice of a man who had already decided that keeping the peace tonight was more important than being right. Thomas looked at Pike. He looked at the 3 armed men standing behind Amos, whose eyes were patient and empty, in the way that men get when they are paid to wait. He looked at the room full of townspeople who had been ready to stand up 15 minutes ago, and were now standing very still instead. The old feeling came back like water rising in a low place. He had seen it before. The moment when a crowd that was angry became a crowd that was afraid, and fear was always quieter than anger, and it always won. He had watched it happen in fields, and in towns, and in places he did not like to name out loud anymore. And every time, the person left standing in the open had been him. He thought about what usually came next. The trouble was never just his own. That was the part he could not outrun. It followed him, and it landed on whoever was nearby, and the nearby people were always the ones who could least afford it. That was the lesson the war had carved into him. Not in a single moment, but slowly, one failure at a time. His eyes went to the door. It was right there. 4 steps, maybe 5. His horse was at the livery. His bedroll was on the horse. He had come into this town with nothing, and he could leave with nothing, and the only thing that would change was the mile marker. Rosie made a small sound, not a word, just a breath that caught in the middle and came out uneven. Thomas did not look at her. He could not afford to look at her. He was still staring at the door. Then something grabbed his sleeve. Not hard, just a boy's fingers, thin and certain, wrapping around the worn canvas of his jacket at the forearm. He did not pull. He just held on. Thomas looked down. Ben Harper stood beside him with his chin up, and both eyes red from crying, though he was not crying now. He was looking at Thomas with an expression that had no begging in it at all. It was just the face of a boy who had already been left by enough people to know exactly what it looked like when another one was about to go. "You promised without saying it," Ben said. Thomas opened his mouth. He did not know what he meant to say. Then he made the mistake of looking up. Rosie and Ruth were watching him from inside Abigail's shawl. Rosie's eyes were wide, and her chin was trembling, and she was waiting in that particular way that children wait when they have already learned that waiting does not always mean someone comes. Ruth was perfectly still, holding her doll against her chest, watching Thomas with dark, careful eyes that had already seen too much for 6 years old. They were waiting to find out whether he was different. Thomas felt something move through him, slow and deep, like a door swinging open in a house that had been shut up too long. He turned back toward the room. He planted his boots flat on the freight office floor, and he looked at Amos Harper, and he said, "Those little girls don't go anywhere tonight." The silence after Thomas spoke was not a peaceful kind. It was the held breath kind, where everyone in the room was deciding something at the same time. Amos stared at Thomas for a long moment. His jaw moved once, like he was chewing on a word he had decided not to say yet. Then he looked at Sheriff Pike with flat, expectant eyes. Pike turned his hat around in his hands one more time. He looked at the children. He looked at Amos's hired men. He looked at the floor. "I am not arresting anybody tonight," he said finally. His voice came out rougher than he probably intended. "There is no clear cause. The hearing is in the morning. That is soon enough." Amos's expression did not change much, just a slight tightening around the eyes. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket and looked at Thomas like a man measuring a fence post for later removal. "Fine," he said. "The court will settle what you could not." He said it to Pike, but he was still looking at Thomas. Then he turned and walked out, his hired men falling in behind him without a word. The room let out its breath. Abigail was already moving. She had Rosie by one hand and Ruth by the other, the shawls still wrapped around their thin shoulders. "Come on then," she said in the firm, no-nonsense voice of a woman who had managed hard things before. "You children need something warm in your stomachs and a safe place to sleep, and neither of those things is here." Miss Lydia gathered Ben with a hand on his shoulder, and nodded once at Thomas. There was a question in her eyes, but she did not ask it out loud. Thomas picked up his rifle from where he had leaned it against the wall and followed them out. The main street of Mercy Crossing was going purple and gray in the evening light. A few townspeople were still standing on the boardwalk, watching, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just watching. The way people do when they are not yet sure which way things are going to fall. Amos's voice came from somewhere behind them, raised just enough to carry. The court will see to it in the morning, every last one of them. Nobody answered him. Abigail's seamstress shop sat 2 buildings down from the general store, a narrow place with fabric samples in the front window and a warm yellow light showing through the glass. She unlocked it quickly and ushered the children inside without ceremony. The back room was small and smelled like cedar and beeswax and something that had been simmering on the small iron stove in the corner. A pot of beef stew, thick and dark, with a round of bread sitting on the cutting board beside it. Abigail served it without a word of fuss, setting 3 bowls on the low wooden work table and pulling a crate close for Ben to sit on. Thomas did not come inside. He settled himself on the back step, just outside the rear door, and leaned his rifle across his knees. The alley behind the shop was dim and quiet. A dog somewhere 2 streets over barked twice, and then stopped. The stars were starting to show above the roof lines. He listened to the children eating, the soft clink of spoons. Abigail's low voice telling Ruth there was more if she wanted it. Ben asking something Thomas could not quite make out, and Miss Lydia answering in her careful schoolteacher way. After a while, the back door opened a crack, and Rosie's face appeared in the gap, round and solemn, with a bread crust in one hand. "Mr. Thomas," she said, "do you have any children?" Thomas looked at her. "No," he said. She thought about that. "Oh," she said. Then she stayed in the doorway a little longer, chewing her bread crust. Behind her, Ruth appeared, quieter, her doll tucked under her arm. She looked at Thomas with those steady, watching eyes of hers and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Did you ever want some?" Thomas opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. He looked out at the dark alley and did not answer. After the children slept, Abigail brought Thomas a bowl of stew and a stub of candle in a tin holder and left him to it without conversation, which was exactly what he needed. He ate slowly. When the bowl was empty, he set it down on the step beside him and reached into his jacket and unfolded the Bible page. The candle flame was small, but steady. He held the page close and read the children's names again. Ben, Rosie, Ruth. Then the inheritance line in Margaret's careful hand. Then lower, where the writing was smaller and different, 2 names listed as witnesses. The first was Abigail Bell. Thomas ran his eye to the second name and went very still. Clara Wren. Thomas sat with the Bible page in his hand for a long time. The candle beside him burned low. The alley was quiet. Somewhere behind him, through the thin walls of the seamstress shop, he could hear the soft breathing of sleeping children. Clara Wren. Her name sat there, in plain ink, like she had just written it. Like she had known he would find it someday, and had pressed her pen down a little harder than necessary, just to make sure it lasted. He folded the page carefully and stood up. He walked a few steps out into the alley, away from the door, away from the light. He stood there in the dark with his hand pressed flat against the rough wood of the fence post beside him, and he breathed in and out and tried to hold himself together. He could not. Clara had been gentle in the way that strong rivers are gentle, quiet on the surface, but moving with purpose underneath. She had a way of walking into a room and making the scared people in it feel like maybe things would be all right. She used to press her hand against his chest when he woke from bad dreams, not saying anything, just keeping her hand there until his heart slowed down. The fever had taken her in 4 days. He had been at her side for all of them, and it had not made a difference. She was just gone, Like a candle someone cups their hand around and blows out. And all the watching and sitting and holding her hand had not saved her any more than his best efforts had saved anyone else. He had been useless then. He was still useless now. That was what he believed. He heard the back door open. He did not turn around. Abigail Bell came and stood a few feet away from him. She did not rush to speak. She looked up at the stars for a moment, like she was gathering her words carefully. "You found her name," she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded once. Abigail folded her arms against the night chill. "Clara stayed in Mercy Crossing one winter, 6 years back, maybe 7. A bad storm came through and closed the road north for near 2 weeks. She boarded with me." She paused. Margaret Harper was heavy with those twins and scared. It was her first winter without her husband. Clara sat with her through the whole delivery. Held little Ruth first, before Margaret even got her arms around her. Thomas closed his eyes. "Clara was like that," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "She was," Abigail agreed. When the storm cleared and the road opened up, Margaret asked Clara to witness what she had written in the Bible. The children's names. The inheritance. She was afraid Amos would try something someday. She told Clara that if that day ever came, she hoped God would send someone with enough spine to stand between those children and that man. The fence post was solid under Thomas's hand. He pressed against it a little harder. "Clara made her a promise," Abigail said quietly. "She said, if Amos ever threatened those children, she would find a way to help." Thomas turned then. He looked at Abigail in the pale dark. "Clara has been gone for 3 years." Abigail looked back at him with the steady patience of a woman who had buried her own husband and kept breathing anyway. "Maybe she is," she said, "but her name is on that page, and you are standing in this alley." Something cracked open in Thomas's chest. He turned back toward the fence and pressed both hands flat against it and dropped his head forward. "I am afraid," he said. It came out low and raw. "I am afraid I will fail them, the way I failed others. I have stood between people and harm before, and it did not save them. It did not save any of them." Abigail was quiet for just a moment. Then she said, "Then fail standing beside them, Mr. Wren, not riding away from them." The sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridge when Thomas heard the back door of the seamstress shop creak open. He did not look up right away. He was sitting on an overturned crate with his back against the wall, his knife in one hand and a whetstone in the other. The motion was slow and steady, back and forth. The quiet scrape of stone against steel was the only sound in the alley. He had not slept. Ben stepped outside in stocking feet, his boots hanging from one hand. He looked at Thomas with the careful eyes of a boy who had learned not to assume grown men would still be there in the morning. Thomas glanced up. "Sun's barely up," he said. "I know." Ben sat down on the back step and pulled his boots on. He watched Thomas work the knife for a moment. "Are you going to use that on somebody?" "No." Thomas turned the blade and drew the stone along the other edge. "Just steadies my hands." Ben seemed to accept that. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked out at the narrow strip of pale sky above the alley. After a while he said, "Mama used to do things with her hands when she was worried too. She would mend harness straps, even when they did not need mending." Thomas set the whetstone down on his knee. "Tell me about her freight business." Ben looked at him, like he was surprised anyone wanted to know. "She ran 4 wagon routes," Ben said. 2 short ones and 2 long ones. The short routes went out to the Callaway Ranch and the Dunn Homestead. The long ones went north past the creek, crossing to 3 different ranches up in the hill country. He pulled a loose thread from his boot and flicked it away. "She carried medicine mostly. And flour. Seed grain in spring. Tools when somebody needed a new axle or a hitch plate. Sometimes mail when the postal rider was behind. Sounds like she kept a lot of people going, Thomas said. She did. Ben's voice was quiet but steady. People counted on her, especially in winter. Doc Halloran said more than once that Mrs. Harper's wagon was worth as much as his medicine bag because she got his supplies through when nobody else would make the run. Thomas folded his knife closed and rested it on his knee. And Amos? Ben's jaw tightened. He was 11 years old, but the look that crossed his face belonged to someone who had spent too long watching something ugly from close up. Amos tried to buy into the business after Papa died, Ben said. Mama told him no. She said she did not need a partner. She needed her routes, left alone. He picked at a knot in his bootlace. He told her a woman running freight was embarrassing to the Harper name. She told him the Harper name was on her wagon because she and Papa built it together, and it was going to stay there. Thomas almost smiled. He didn't let it show, but it was close. He hated that she made it work, Ben said. He really hated that the ranchers trusted her more than they trusted him. Folks would wait an extra week for Mama's wagon rather than deal with Amos's man. The alley was warming slowly as the sky lightened. A rooster complained somewhere down the street. The town was beginning to wake. The back door opened again, and Miss Lydia Crane came through it carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle and moving with the brisk purpose of a woman who had already been up for 2 hours. She handed Thomas and Ben each a biscuit without ceremony and sat down on the second crate like she owned it. "The circuit judge rides in this evening," she said. "I heard it from the postmaster not 20 minutes ago." She looked at Thomas directly. "Amos filed for emergency guardianship last night. He is claiming Margaret died owing more than the business was worth. He says there is nothing left for the children to inherit." Thomas looked down at the biscuit in his hand. The Bible page was proof of Margaret's intentions, but intentions without records were just words on paper. "We need more than the Bible page," he said. Ben was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, like a door opening just a crack. "Mama used to say something," he said slowly, "when she talked about keeping things safe." He looked up. She said, "When men come looking in drawers, put truth where women work." Miss Lydia pulled the front door of the seamstress shop closed and turned the latch. The morning light came through the front window in long, pale strips, landing across bolts of folded cloth, a sewing table scattered with spools and pins, and the four of them standing in the middle of it all, like a small war council. Rosie and Ruth were still asleep in Abigail's back room. Thomas had checked twice. "We have until evening," Miss Lydia said. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, the way she probably stood when she addressed her classroom. Clear, calm, like she was refusing to let panic take up space in the room. "The judge will want to hear from both sides. If Amos walks in with paperwork, and we walk in with nothing but a Bible page, he will frame it as a grieving uncle trying to care for children a stranger stirred up." "The Bible page has 2 witness signatures," Thomas said. "I know that, but Amos will call it forged or stolen. He has already told half the town Ben took it without permission." She looked at Ben. "We need the ledgers, the ownership papers, paid debt receipts, anything Margaret kept to prove the business was solvent, and that those children are heirs to something real." Abigail was already moving. She went to the far wall where 3 deep wicker baskets sat stacked beside a bureau. She lifted the first one onto her work table and began going through it with practiced hands, the kind that knew fabric the way Thomas knew horses. She pulled out folded lining scraps, old mending bundles tied with string, a paper of pins, swatches in every color of dust and prairie. "Margaret brought me her mending whenever she passed through," Abigail said quietly, not stopping her hands. She was not the kind of woman to sit still during a long haul. She would sew on the wagon bench while Ben drove. She set aside a bundle and lifted another. "I always thought she hid her worry in the stitching." Miss Lydia had moved to the small table near the window, where Abigail kept a stack of papers, old receipts, and donated reading sheets. She sorted through them with careful fingers. Margaret sent school books, with her last delivery before she took ill. She donated 2 readers and a grammar primer. I thought it was generosity. She paused and lifted a worn paper. Maybe she tucked something in with them. She went through each page slowly. Nothing. Ben stood near the doorway to the back room, close enough to hear his sister's breathing. He helped Abigail lift the second basket and held pieces of cloth while she searched behind them. His hands were steady, but his eyes kept moving to the window. Thomas checked behind the bureau. He pulled it gently away from the wall and looked at the gap. Nothing but mouse dust and a lost spool. They worked for a good while. The shop stayed quiet, except for the soft sounds of cloth and paper being moved and replaced. Abigail sat down slowly when the third basket was empty. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. Miss Lydia set the last donated paper down. Thomas looked at the floor, not giving up, just thinking. Then Rosie appeared in the doorway to the back room, her hair loose and her shawl dragging off one shoulder. She blinked at all of them with sleepy eyes. "Are you looking for Mama's papers?" she asked. Everyone looked at her. "She sewed important paper into Papa's blue coat," Rosie said simply, like it was something she had watched enough times to remember without trying. She put it inside the lining so it would not get wet on the wagon. Ben went very still. "The blue coat," he said. He looked at Thomas. "It was Papa's. Mama kept it at the ranch after he died. She said it was the warmest coat she ever owned, and she was not giving it up." He paused. "But after she died, Amos went through the ranch. He took things to the freight barn, crates, boxes. I do not know what all." Thomas was already reaching for his hat. "Then that is where we go," he said. He looked at Ben. "We're not stealing truth. We're bringing it back." The back gate of Abigail's yard opened onto a narrow dirt path that ran between 2 leaning fence lines. Thomas went first, moving low and quiet the way old habits never fully leave a man. Ben followed close behind, matching his steps without being told. The sun was high, but the air still carried the cool edge of morning. Somewhere on the main street, a wagon creaked past. A dog barked twice and went quiet. Thomas paused at the end of the path and looked both ways along the back of the buildings. One of Amos's hired men was leaning against a post near the front of the general store, far enough away that he was watching the street and not the alley. Thomas watched him for a moment. The man picked at his teeth and looked bored. Good. Thomas touched Ben's shoulder and nodded left. They moved. They stayed off the main street, cutting through an empty stock pen behind the hardware shop. The pen smelled like old hay and dried mud. The gate hung crooked on one hinge, and Thomas lifted it gently so it would not scrape. Ben ducked through without making a sound. They crossed behind the feed store, skirted the edge of a lumber yard, and came around the far end of town where the buildings thinned out and the road turned to dry ruts heading north. The freight barn sat at the edge of that stretch, set back from the road behind a split-rail fence. It was a wide, heavy-built structure, older than most of the town, with a tin roof gone rust-brown at the edges. Ben stopped walking. He stared at it for a moment, like a person looking at something that used to mean something good. "She kept Bess and Hattie in the 2 center stalls," he said quietly. "Those were the lead horses. Best freight pullers in 3 counties, she always said." He swallowed. "I have not been back since she died." Thomas did not rush him. He just stood there beside the boy and let the moment be what it was. Then Ben straightened up. "Let's go." The side door was latched, but not locked. Thomas lifted the latch slowly and pushed the door inward, letting his eyes adjust before stepping inside. The barn was dim and smelled of paint and sawdust, not horses. The stalls on the right were empty. The freight horses were gone, moved somewhere else already. Thomas felt Ben go tense beside him, and understood why without asking. 2 wagons sat in the center of the barn floor. Thomas walked to the nearest one and looked at the side panel. He could see where lettering had been, the ghost of painted words still visible beneath a fresh coat of dark paint. Harper Family Freight. Someone had gone over it in thick, fast strokes. Not careful work. Just covering. Just erasing. The second wagon had sale tags tied to the wheel spokes with twine, numbers written in pencil, a buyer's name Thomas did not recognize. He stood there for a moment, his jaw tight. Then Ben grabbed his sleeve and pointed toward the back wall. Crates, a whole stack of them, floor to ceiling along the left side of the barn. Thomas moved closer and read the labels. His chest grew heavy as he went down the row. One crate marked with the name of an elderly rancher on the South Road. Inside, through the slatted side, he could see glass medicine bottles wrapped in cloth. Another crate below it held seed grain bags. The recipient, a homesteader named Thomas recognized from a conversation at the general store. A man who had mentioned waiting on a spring order that never came. And near the bottom of the stack, a flat wooden box labeled simply, Mercy Crossing School, Miss Crane, with the Harper Freight seal stamped on the side. Thomas stood back and looked at all of it. He understood then what Amos had been doing. Keeping people waiting, keeping them worried and short and uncertain. A town that needed things and could not get them was a town that stayed quiet. Outside, footsteps crunched across the dry ground, slow and deliberate, moving toward the barn door. Thomas grabbed Ben by the shoulder and pulled him fast and low behind a stack of flour sacks against the wall. Thomas pressed his back against the flour sacks and did not breathe. Ben was crouched beside him, small and still, one hand gripping Thomas's sleeve. The barn door swung open wide. Boot heels hit the wood floor planks, sharp and deliberate. Then 2 more sets of boots behind them, heavier, slower. Close it. That was Amos. The door scraped shut. Thomas turned his head, just enough to see through the gap between 2 stacked sacks. Amos Harper stood in the center of the barn floor, his coat brushed clean and his hat straight, looking like a man who owned everything he could see. He had the kind of face that smiled at church and meant nothing by it. 2 men flanked him, big-shouldered workers with the blank, patient look of men who got paid not to ask questions. Amos walked to the nearest wagon and ran his hand along the freshly painted side panel. "Good enough," he said. "Griggs's man comes tomorrow. We need the teams moved to the south pen before noon." He turned to one of the hired men. "The blue coat, where is it?" "Rolled up in the tack room," the man said. "Got it last night from the ranch." "Burn it." Ben flinched beside Thomas. Thomas put a firm, steady hand on the boy's arm and held it there. "There ain't no records in it," the hired man said, not arguing, just noting. "I know that," Amos said flatly, "but it keeps people looking in the wrong place, and I want that looking to have an end. Burn the coat, burn the shelf papers beside it, and do it in the back pit where the ash disappears." He straightened his cuffs. "If that judge starts asking about duplicate contracts, there is nothing to find." The second hired man shifted his weight. "What about the boy? The older one?" Amos's expression did not change. "Ben stays hired out. There is a ranch north of Clover Fork that needs a hand through summer. He is old enough, and he will not be here to speak at any hearing if he is 3 days right away." Thomas felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. He kept his hand steady on Ben's arm. "And the little ones?" the first man asked. "Separated." Amos said it the way a man says a word he has already stopped caring about. 2 families, different counties. By the time any court catches up to paperwork, they will have new names, and nobody will remember what Margaret Harper left in a Bible. He glanced at the crates along the wall with no particular feeling. "Leave those. They are not worth moving." He turned for the door. "Have the wagons rolled out before the judge sits down tonight. I want the routes signed over by morning." The door opened. Boots crossed the threshold. Then it pulled shut again, and the barn went quiet. Neither Thomas nor Ben moved for a long moment. Then Ben let out a breath that had been held too long, ragged and thin. Thomas rose slowly from behind the flour sacks and stood in the dim light of the barn. He looked at the crates along the wall. He looked at the painted-over wagon. He looked at the empty tackroom doorway, where the coat was already gone. Ben stood beside him, pale, and gripping his own hands together. "They were going to send me away," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Thomas said. "No point in softening it." Ben was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up. "What do we do?" Thomas walked to the nearest wagon and checked the wheel bolts with his hand. Solid. He moved to the hitch rigging hanging on the wall peg and lifted it down. "We load those crates," he said. Ben looked at him. "Every one of them," Thomas said. "We hitch the wagon, and we roll it right down the middle of this town." He handed Ben one end of the hitch strap. "Your mother served this town. Today, this town remembers it." He pushed both barn doors open into the noon sun. The wagon wheels turned slow and steady on the packed dirt road. Thomas sat up on the bench with the reins loose in his hands and his eyes forward. Ben sat beside him, back straight, chin up, trying to look braver than he felt. Behind them, the crates shifted and knocked against each other with every rut in the road. People stopped walking. A woman in a flour-dusted apron stepped out of the bakery and shielded her eyes. Two men leaning against the barbershop post straightened up. A group of boys playing near the water trough went still and stared. Thomas kept the horses at an easy walk down the center of Main Street. He heard Amos before he saw him. "That is stolen property." Amos came out of the freight office at a fast stride, coat flapping, face tight with fury. Behind him came both hired men. He pointed a finger at the wagon like a man who expected the world to stop on his command. "That wagon belongs to the Harper estate," he shouted. He was pitching his voice for the street, not for Thomas. He wanted witnesses. "This man is a thief and a drifter, and I want the sheriff brought right now." Thomas pulled the horses to a stop in front of the general store. He climbed down from the bench without hurrying. He tied the lead rope to the post and walked around to the back of the wagon. He did not look at Amos. He pulled the first crate forward and read the label out loud. "Jensen Family, Bluff Creek Road." He looked up. "Doctor prescribed medicine. Signed and paid for 3 weeks ago." Silence. Thomas reached for the next crate. "Hollis Farm. 2 bushels winter rye seed. 1 bushel spring barley. Paid in full." He set the crate on the edge of the wagon bed. "Anybody know a Hollis family?" A man near the hardware store took one slow step forward. He was a lean fellow in worn suspenders with dirt still on his boots from a morning in the fields. He stared at the crate like he did not quite trust his own eyes. "That is my order," he said quietly. Thomas nodded and moved it toward him. A thin sound came from near the edge of the gathering crowd. An older woman in a gray dress pushed through to the front. Her hands were shaking before she even reached the wagon. "Jensen," she said. Her voice barely made it out. "That is us. That is my name." She touched the side of the medicine crate. Her mouth pressed into a tight line, and her eyes filled fast. "My husband has been sick since February," she said. She was not talking to Thomas exactly. She was talking to the air. "We were told the order got lost. We were told it never arrived." She pressed one hand over her mouth. The tears came quietly, the way grief does when it has been waiting a long time. Ben reached down from the wagon bench and slid the crate gently to the edge for her. Thomas was already reading the next label. Crane, Mercy Crossing Schoolhouse. 30 reading primers. 1 arithmetic text. Donated by Margaret Harper. Miss Lydia pushed forward from the near side of the crowd. She stopped when she saw the crate. Her hand went to her collar. She stood very still for a moment, and then she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin, because Miss Lydia Crane was not the kind of woman who wept in the street, even when she needed to. Margaret ordered those in January, she said clearly, turning to face the people around her. She wanted every child in this town to have a reader. Her voice was steady and deliberate. She paid for them herself. The crowd shifted. People looked at one another. Then they looked at Amos. He had gone very still near the freight office door. His hired men stood close on either side of him, but they were not moving either. Sheriff Calder Pike stepped out from the front of the hardware store. His hat was in his hand. He looked at the medicine woman, at the farmer with his seed crate, at Miss Lydia holding a school book that had been sitting in a barn for 3 weeks. His jaw worked for a moment before any words came. "Get these goods delivered," he said. His voice was not loud. It was not bold. But it was said in front of the whole town, and everyone heard it. Every crate, to every name on the label. Amos turned his gaze from the sheriff to Thomas. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look on his face was slow and deliberate and cold, like a man who was not finished, but was willing to wait. Then he turned back toward the freight office, and both hired men followed him inside. The afternoon sun was warm on the backs of the horses, as Thomas turned the wagon down the first road out of town. Rosie sat between Abigail and Miss Lydia on the bench, bundled in a brown shawl that was slightly too big for her. It kept slipping off one shoulder, and she kept tugging it back up with great seriousness, like it was an important job that required her full attention. Ruth sat on Abigail's other side, quiet and watchful, her doll pressed against her chest. Ben rode in the back with his legs dangling over the edge of the wagon bed, one hand resting on the remaining crates to keep them steady on the ruts. Thomas drove. He did not say much. He did not need to. The road did the talking for him, rolling out past dry grass and split-rail fences toward the scattered farms and homesteads that depended on Margaret Harper's roots. Their first stop was a low wooden house, set back from the road behind a pair of old elm trees. The woman who came to the door was thin and tired-looking, with a baby on her hip and a little boy tugging her apron. When she saw the seed crates being unloaded from the wagon, she went very still. Her husband came around from the back of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the barley sacks. Then he looked at Thomas. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "Your name was on the label," Thomas said. "They were in the Harper freight barn." The man said nothing for a moment. He picked up the edge of one sack and checked the mark on it. Then he set it down carefully and turned to his wife. She was already crying. The couple shook Ben's hand. The woman patted Rosie's cheek and thanked them in a voice too full to hold steady. Miss Lydia wrote the family's name in a small notebook she had brought along. She asked them quiet, careful questions, and they answered every one. The next stop was the Jensen place. The old woman from the street was already home, sitting on the porch with her hands folded, waiting. Her husband was inside. He was a gray-haired man, propped up in a bed near the window, pale and slow-moving. When Thomas carried the medicine crate through the door and set it on the table, the old man turned his head and looked at it for a long time. "Margaret Harper sent this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Ben said from the doorway. "Before she died." The old man closed his eyes. His wife sat beside him and put her hand over his. Thomas stepped back outside and stood by the wagon with his hat in his hands. He looked out at the flat horizon and breathed slowly through his nose. They visited 4 more families that afternoon. A widow with 2 teenage sons who had been waiting on lumber nails and lamp oil. A young homesteader couple who had given up on their seed order and nearly sold their plot. An elderly man who had believed his medicine was simply gone, lost in some mix-up he never fully understood. At every stop, Miss Lydia wrote names and asked questions. At every stop, people said the same kind of thing in different words. That Margaret's business was reliable, that she always delivered, that they had never owed her a debt she did not give them fair time to settle. By the time the wagon rolled back toward Mercy Crossing, the crates were empty, and the sun was sitting low and orange above the rooftops. Rosie looked out at the road ahead and smiled. It was small at first, just the corners of her mouth turning up while she watched a meadowlark lift off a fence post. But then it grew, easy and real, the kind of smile that belongs to children who have been frightened a long time, and finally feel the fear let go for just a moment. Ruth reached over from Abigail's side and found Thomas's hand where it rested on the reins. She did not say anything. She just held on with her small fingers, steady and sure, for 3 long breaths before she let go again. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. Ben sat up straighter in the wagon bed. "We could keep the ranch," he said. It was not exactly a question. "Couldn't we?" Thomas did not answer right away. He turned the horses onto Main Street and let the wagon slow to a stop near the schoolhouse. "Your mother built something real," Thomas said. "Real things are worth fighting for." Miss Lydia climbed down from the bench and smoothed her skirt. She looked at the notebook in her hand, then at the children. "I want the 3 of you inside," she said. "You can rest while I write out what these families told us. The judge will want statements, and I intend to have them ready." Ben helped the twins down from the wagon. Rosie kept hold of his hand, and Ruth kept hold of her doll, and the 3 of them followed Miss Lydia up the schoolhouse steps. Thomas tied the horses and turned to check the street. Amos was standing in the gap between the feed store and the cooper's shop, just standing there in the shadow, watching the schoolhouse door close behind the children. His face was unreadable from across the road, but he was watching. The sun was going down over Mercy Crossing, painting the schoolhouse windows a deep amber color, like the inside of a lantern. Someone had pushed the school desks to the walls and pulled the long table to the center of the room. A blue cloth had been spread across it. 2 candles burned at either end. The smell of wood smoke and warm bread moved through the open door and out into the cooling evening air. Gideon Pratt came first, carrying a covered pot of bean soup. He set it on the table without much ceremony and pulled off his hat, holding it with both hands, not quite sure where to look. He had not said much today, but he had been one of the first to step forward on Main Street. That counted for something. The elderly widow from the Jensen place came next, carrying a pan of cornbread. She wore her good shawl. Behind her came the young homesteader couple from the seed delivery, the woman holding a jar of preserved peaches, like it was something precious. Abigail Bell arrived carrying a basket of biscuits, still wrapped in a dish towel to hold the warmth. She set it near the twins, knowing without being told that Rosie and Ruth would need something soft and familiar within reach. Miss Lydia lit the candles and called the children to the table. Rosie climbed onto the bench and immediately pulled a biscuit from the basket. She did not eat it right away. She just held it, feeling its warmth against her palms, the way a child holds something good before she quite believes it is real. Ruth sat beside her, doll in her lap. She looked around at the faces of the people gathered, all of them a little shy, a little uncertain, trying to do something kind in a place that had been unkind for too long. Ruth studied each face carefully, the way she always did, as if reading words written somewhere the rest of the world could not see. Ben sat at the head of the table. He had the family Bible page in his hand. He smoothed it flat on the cloth in front of him, careful as a man twice his age handling an important document. Then he looked up at the people gathered around the table, and the doorway, and in the small space along the wall. "My mama worked real hard," he said. His voice did not shake, though it was close. "She got up before light most mornings. She loaded those wagons herself sometimes when the hired hand was sick. She said this town deserved somebody they could count on." He looked down at the Bible page. "I just want everybody to know she did not forget any of you. What was in those crates today? She meant for you to have it. That was her, not somebody else. That was my mama." The elderly widow pressed her fingers to her mouth. Gideon studied the floor. The young homesteader's wife leaned into her husband's arm. Miss Lydia set her hand on Ben's shoulder for a moment, steady and warm. The supper was quiet after that, but not an unhappy kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people are grateful and a little ashamed of themselves at the same time, and they are trying to figure out what to do with both feelings at once. Thomas stood in the schoolhouse doorway the whole time. He did not sit at the table. He was not sure he belonged inside the circle of candlelight, so he stayed at the edge of it, arms folded, watching the children eat. Rosie finished 2 biscuits and part of a third. Ruth ate slowly and gave the last of her cornbread to Ben without comment, which made Ben smile. After the supper dishes were cleared and the youngest guests had gone home, Abigail brought the twins to Thomas, where he stood in the doorway. Each girl held something small in her hands. They were handkerchiefs, simple ones, neatly hemmed, with a tiny flower stitched into the corner of each. Rosie held hers up to Thomas, with both hands. "Miss Abigail made them," she said. "From cloth your wife left here once. Miss Abigail kept it all this time." Thomas looked at Abigail. She nodded once, her eyes soft. "Your wife left a small bundle of fabric the winter she helped Mama with us," Rosie continued, tilting her head the way she did when she was making sure she remembered the words just right. "Miss Abigail said your wife helped Mama, so now we're helping you remember her happy." Thomas took the handkerchiefs. He held them carefully, one in each hand, and looked down at the small stitched flowers. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright. He did not make a sound. But in the doorway of the Mercy Crossing schoolhouse, with the last of the sunset fading behind him and 2 little girls watching his face, Thomas Wren wept. Quietly. Just a few tears finding their way down the weathered lines of his face, the way water finally finds a crack that was always there. Rosie patted his hand once, satisfied, and went back inside to find Ruth. Ben came and stood beside him after a moment. "Thomas," he said. He did not say Mr. anymore. Just Thomas. "Would you stay at the ranch with us? Just until the stars stop feeling scary." Thomas pressed the handkerchiefs against his chest and looked out at the dark street. Then he looked down at Ben. "Yes," he said. The night had settled cool, and still over Mercy Crossing, by the time supper was cleared and the candles were blown out. Thomas walked the children back to Abigail's shop with Miss Lydia beside him and Ben at his left shoulder. Rosie held Ruth's hand the whole way. Their small boots made soft sounds on the packed dirt road. Nobody spoke much. The day had been long, and the children were wrung out from it, their bodies finally giving way to the tiredness they had been fighting since morning. Abigail had the back room made up with blankets on the floor and a low lamp burning. Ruth went down almost immediately, her doll tucked under her chin. Rosie lasted long enough to ask if Thomas was staying outside again. "Yes," he said. She nodded and closed her eyes. Ben sat up a little longer. He looked at Thomas from the blankets with those steady eyes that were too old for an 11-year-old. "You should sleep," Thomas told him. "So should you," Ben said. Thomas almost smiled. "Go on." Ben put his head down. Within a few minutes, his breathing slowed and went even. Thomas stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the 3 of them in the low lamplight. The handkerchiefs were still folded in his shirt pocket. He pressed his hand briefly against them, then turned and pulled the door nearly shut behind him. Miss Lydia was waiting in Abigail's front room. She had her shawl pulled tight and her school satchel over her arm. "I will be back first thing in the morning," she said quietly. "The judge arrives by evening. We need to be ready." "We will be," Thomas said. She held his eyes for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, then thought better of it and stepped out into the night. Thomas told Abigail he would be back within the hour and crossed the quiet street toward the livery. The town was mostly dark. A lamp burned in the saloon at the far end of the block, and somewhere a dog was moving along a fence line, nose low. Thomas passed the general store and the empty post office and pushed open the livery side door. His horse lifted its head and blew softly. Thomas ran his hand down the animal's neck, checked the water bucket, and refilled the feed. The familiar smell of hay and horse sweat settled around him, steady and calm. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to, just breathing. Gideon was in the back stall, awake, sitting on an overturned pail. The old man looked up without surprise. "Figured you would come by," Gideon said. "The Harper freight teams," Thomas said. "You know where Amos is keeping them tonight?" "Still in the barn, far as I know." Gideon rubbed the back of his neck. "I can sleep out here. Keep an ear open." "I would appreciate that," Thomas said. He was stepping back through the livery door and onto Main Street when he saw it. Orange. A deep, flickering orange rising above the roofline at the far end of the street, right where the Harper freight barn sat behind its fence. Thomas ran. His boots hit the dirt hard, and he covered the distance in a dead sprint, the warm air pressing against his face as the glow grew brighter with every stride. He could smell the smoke before he reached the fence, thick and sharp, and rolling low along the ground. The barn doors were latched from the outside. He threw the crossbar and dragged them open. Heat punched him backward. He pulled his bandana up over his mouth and went in. The left wall was burning. One wagon was already lost, flames crawling up its wooden sides. But the horses were the thing. 2 of Margaret Harper's freight horses were screaming in their stalls, throwing themselves against the wood, eyes white with terror. Thomas went to the nearest stall, yanked the latch, and got clear as the horse blew past him. He went for the second one, but the animal was kicking blind, and the stall door had swollen in the heat. He hit it with his shoulder once, twice, and on the third strike something gave way in his left side, deep and white-hot, an old injury cracking open along a scar that had never fully healed. He barely felt it. He got the door open and pushed the horse out and followed it into the yard, bent double, coughing hard enough to taste copper. He went down on one knee in the dirt. Townspeople were already coming with buckets. Gideon shouted something from the fence. Voices crossed each other in the dark. The horses were caught and tied at the water trough. Thomas pressed his hand to his side and looked up. 2 of Amos's men stood near the fence. One of them was pointing at Thomas, talking to Sheriff Pike, who had just arrived with his coat thrown on over his nightclothes. The other man held up Thomas's bedroll. "Found it right there by the wall," the man said loudly, so the gathering crowd could hear every word. "Saw him running out just before the fire took hold." Pike looked at the bedroll. He looked at Thomas in the dirt, coughing, hand pressed to his side. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but another cough took him, and when he pulled his hand from his side, the firelight showed it dark and wet. Amos stepped out of the shadow behind the hired men. His coat was buttoned neat, his hat straight, as if he had been awake and dressed and waiting. "Sheriff," Amos said, "I want this man in a cell before he destroys anything else." Pike stood still for a long moment. The bucket line kept moving behind him. The fire was going down. The smoke was not. "Thomas Wren," Pike said, his voice flat and quiet and ashamed. "I need you to come with me." Thomas did not fight it. He let Gideon help him stand. He walked with Pike down the dark street while the crowd watched and said nothing, and Amos's voice followed them. "And I want those children returned to my custody tonight," Amos called, "for their own protection." Thomas was still coughing when the jail cell door closed behind him. He sat on the cot and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the blood on his knuckles in the dim lamplight. Outside, through the small, barred window, he could hear Amos's voice carrying across the street toward Abigail's shop. The jail cell smelled like old wood and rust. Thomas sat on the thin cot with his back against the stone wall, one hand pressed to his side where the pain came and went in slow, burning waves. Sheriff Pike sat on a stool outside the bars. He had not gone home. He had not slept either. He held his hat in both hands and turned it slowly, round and round, like a man who did not know what to do with his own fingers. "You know I didn't start that fire," Thomas said. Pike kept turning the hat. "What I know and what I can prove are two different things tonight. The bedroll was planted. You know that too." Pike was quiet for a moment. "The way it was placed," he said slowly. "Up against the wall like that. A man starting a fire doesn't leave his own bedroll that close to the flame." He stopped turning the hat. "It feels wrong. I'll grant you that. Then let me out. I can't." Pike set the hat on his knee. "Amos has men posted outside. If I open that door before the judge gets here, somebody ends up shot. Maybe you. Maybe one of those kids." He looked up then, and his face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I'm keeping order, Wren. It's the only thing I've got left to give." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Keeping order isn't the same as keeping faith. Pike had no answer for that. He stood, put his hat on, and walked to the front of the jail without another word. Thomas leaned his head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. Across town, in the back room of Abigail's seamstress shop, the children were still asleep when the knock came at the front door. Abigail was already awake. She had been sitting in her chair by the window with her sewing on her lap and her eyes on the street. She saw the men before she heard the knock. 3 of them, Amos at the front, straight and polished, even at this hour. Miss Lydia appeared in the hallway, her hair pinned quickly, her eyes alert. Abigail went to the door and did not open it. "It is past midnight," she said through the wood. "I have a temporary order signed by Sheriff Pike," Amos said. His voice was pleasant and completely without warmth. "The children are to be returned to my care until the morning hearing. Open the door, Mrs. Bell, or I will have it opened for you." Abigail looked at Miss Lydia. Miss Lydia gave a small, tight shake of her head, but there was nothing they could do. When the door opened, Ben was already standing in the hallway. He had heard everything. He had his arms at his sides and his chin up, and he was trying very hard not to look as young as he was. "You are not taking them," he said. Amos barely glanced at him. He nodded to one of his men, who moved past Ben toward the back room. What followed was not long, but it was terrible. Rosie woke confused, and then understood all at once. She grabbed at Abigail's skirt and called for Thomas, her voice high and sharp and cracking. Ruth woke without a sound, found her doll in the dark, and pressed it against her chest like a shield. She did not cry. She went somewhere inside herself that no one else could reach. Ben put himself between his sisters and Amos's man. The man moved him aside with one arm, not roughly, but without any hesitation at all. Amos steered all 3 children toward the door, with the practiced ease of a man who had planned every step of this. "Only until morning," he said to Abigail and Miss Lydia. "The judge will sort everything out." Rosie was still crying when they crossed the street. Her voice carried in the cold night air. "Thomas. Thomas." Ben heard it. He turned his head toward the jail and saw the small, barred window facing the street. Thomas was there. He was standing at the bars with one hand gripping the iron, his face pale in the darkness, watching them go. There was nothing he could do. It was written plainly across every line of his face. Ben walked to the window. He reached up and pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. Thomas leaned forward. His voice came low and rough through the bars. "I'm still here, boy. I'm still here." The hours before dawn were the longest Thomas had ever known. He sat on the cot, with his back against the wall, and his hand pressed to his side. The wound had stopped bleeding, but it pulled tight every time he breathed too deep. The smoke from the barn still lived in his lungs. He could feel it there, thick and stubborn, like a reminder he had not asked for. Pike sat in his chair near the front desk. He had a lamp burning low. He had not looked at Thomas directly in a long time. Thomas watched him. He had watched men carry guilt before. He knew what it looked like. It looked like a man turning his hat brim over and over. It looked like a man who kept his eyes on the floor. "How long has he had you?" Thomas said. Pike went still. "Amos," Thomas said, "how long has he been holding something over you?" Pike set the hat on the desk. He folded his hands on top of it. "That is not your business, Wren." "Those children are my business," Thomas said, "and you are standing between me and them. So I reckon it is." Pike was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame bent sideways in a thin draft and then steadied. "Cattle deal," Pike finally said. His voice came out flat and dry, like something he had practiced saying alone. 3 years back. I went in on a herd with 2 other men. One of them was Amos. The herd went bad. Fever took half of them before we reached the railhead. I owed money I did not have." He paused. "Amos covered my share. And he has been collecting on it ever since," Thomas said. Pike said nothing, but his jaw moved. "He did not cover your share out of kindness," Thomas said. "He covered it because a man in debt is easier to steer than a man who is free." Pike stood up from the chair. He walked to the small side window and looked out at the dark street. His shoulders were heavy on him, like a coat that had gotten wet and never fully dried. "I know what he is," Pike said quietly. "I have known it for a long time." "Then say so." "It is not that simple." "No," Thomas agreed. "It never is." He shifted on the cot and pressed his hand tighter to his side. "But a badge is not worth much if fear is the one wearing it. You know that better than I do." Pike turned from the window. His face was hard to read in the low light, but something in it had shifted. Not broken open. Not yet. Just cracked along an edge that had been under pressure for a long time. He crossed to the small table near the wall, poured water from the tin pitcher into a cup, and walked it to the cell. He pushed it through the narrow gap between the bars without a word. Thomas took it and drank. Pike stood there a moment. He did not leave. "The burn pattern," he said. His voice was low, like he was talking to himself as much as to Thomas. "At the barn, the way it started along the south wall, low and even like that." He shook his head slowly. "A man dropping his bedroll and running does not start a fire that clean and low. That takes oil and time." He looked at Thomas. "Amos's story does not match what I saw." Thomas held the empty cup. He did not say anything. He let the man think. Pike went back to his chair and sat down heavily. Outside, the street was still dark, but in the narrow gap between 2 buildings across from the jail, a lamp moved. Then another. Abigail Bell stood on the boardwalk in front of her shop, with her shawl pulled tight and her chin set firm. Beside her, Miss Lydia Crane held a small sheaf of papers and spoke in a low, urgent voice to the small group of townspeople gathered around her. The elderly woman who had wept over the medicine, the farmer who had found his seed grain, Gideon, the liveryman, 3 others. Miss Lydia looked at each of them in turn. "Your word matters," she said. "Every one of you can stand before that judge and say what Amos did to you." She paused. "But testimony without records is opinion. Amos will call it grief and rumor and nothing more." She held up the papers. "We still need those ledgers. Without them, he may find a way to turn every one of your voices into doubt." The freight office smelled like old wood and lamp oil. Ben sat against the back wall with Rosie on his left and Ruth on his right. The same room, the same low ceiling, the same single lantern burning in the corner. It felt like stepping backward into the worst day of their lives. Except this time, Ben was not alone in his fear. This time his sisters were watching him to see if he would fall apart. He would not fall apart. Rosie had cried herself into a shallow sleep with her head against his shoulder. Her breathing was soft and slow now, rising and falling like something small that had finally worn itself out. Ben did not move his arm. He let her stay there. Ruth was awake. She always was, long after everyone else had gone quiet. She sat with her doll pressed against her chest and her eyes open, watching the lantern flame like she expected it to say something. He is still out there, Ben said softly, meaning Thomas. Ruth looked at him. He said he was still here, Ben said. I saw him. He was at the window. Ruth did not answer, but she nodded once. That was enough for her. She believed it. Ben shifted slowly, careful not to wake Rosie, and pressed his back more firmly against the wall. The floor was uneven beneath him, the way old wood got when years of weight and moisture pushed the boards out of true. His boot heel caught on a gap near the baseboard, and he looked down. He almost missed it. It was not much, just a short board, no longer than his forearm, fitted between two longer planks near the base of the wall. The nails along one end had been pulled and reset so many times the wood around them had gone soft and gray. You would not notice it unless you were sitting exactly where Ben was sitting, in the dark, with nothing to do but wait. Ben remembered. His mother used to work late in this office sometimes, back when the freight business was still hers. She would let Ben sit with her while she wrote down numbers in her ledger. One evening, when he was maybe 8 years old, she had knelt beside this very wall and lifted that short board and tucked something small into the space beneath. When he asked what she was doing, she had smiled and said, "Keeping safe things safe." He had not thought about that night in years. He moved Rosie carefully, easing her head from his shoulder to the wall, and she stirred, but did not wake. Ben crawled forward on his hands and knees and pressed his fingers along the edge of the short board. It lifted without much resistance, like it had been opened before and remembered the motion. Inside the space beneath it was a shallow pocket of dark. Ben reached in. His fingers found something cool and round. A button. He brought it out and held it near the lantern. It was tin, dark with age, stamped with a small flower pattern along the edge. Not a working coat button. Too pretty for that. A keepsake button, the kind a woman kept because it meant something. Behind it, wrapped in a scrap of muslin, was a dried wildflower. The petals had gone pale and papery, but the shape held. A columbine, he thought, though he was not sure. His mother had kept a little tin of pressed flowers on her windowsill at home, and beneath the flower, folded into a tight square, was a piece of paper. Ben opened it slowly. The handwriting was his mother's. He knew it, the way he knew her voice. "Margaret," it began, "I have thought carefully about what you told me. I believe you are right to be afraid. Men like Amos do not steal in the dark because they prefer it. They steal in the dark because good people hand them the lantern by staying quiet. Keep your record somewhere he will not think to reach. Keep a second set where only you know. If something happens, your children will need proof that cannot be taken from them. Do not wait. Write it down now while everything is still clear. I will pray for you and for them. Clara Wren." Ben read it twice. His throat was tight. This woman, Clara Wren, whose name was on their mother's Bible page, had known. She had seen what Amos was before it ever came to this. He looked up at Ruth. Ruth was already watching him. Her eyes were steady and dark in the lantern light. "Mama said something," Ruth said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She said it more than once. About the coat." She paused, pressing the doll a little closer. She said, "The coat is for them to find. The truth is where your hands pray." Ben stared at her. He turned the words over. He did not understand them yet, not all the way. But something in the back of his mind reached toward them like a hand reaching for a rope in deep water. He folded Clara's note back into its tight square. He looked at Ruth's doll, worn soft from years of being held, with a small seam along its back that Abigail had repaired once, with a few careful stitches. Ben worked the stitching loose with his thumbnail, just enough to open a small gap in the cloth. He tucked the note inside, between the stuffing and the back seam, and pinched the fabric closed again. Ruth watched him do it. She did not object. She held the doll out to him, let him finish, and then pulled it back against her chest. The front door banged open. Amos stood in the doorway with his coat already on, and his hair combed back flat against his head. He looked rested. He looked like a man who expected the day to go his way. "Get up," he said. "All three of you, get yourselves presentable. The judge arrives this morning, and you will look like decent children, not like something dragged from a ditch." The sun had barely cleared the rooftops when Amos pushed the children out the freight office door. He did not shove them. He was too careful for that, especially now, with a judge coming and townspeople already watching from their porches. He simply walked behind them, with his hand resting on Ben's shoulder, like a man guiding something he owned, steering them up the middle of the street toward the town hall. Ben walked straight. He kept his chin up the way his mother used to tell him to when things were hard. Rosie held his hand and tried to match his pace. Ruth walked on Ben's other side, her doll pressed against her middle, her eyes moving quietly over everything they passed. The morning air was cool and sharp. A dog barked somewhere. Smoke curled from a chimney above the bakery. The town was waking up, and it was going to wake up to a hearing that would decide the rest of their lives. Ruth looked at Abigail's shop as they passed it. The window was dark. The door was closed. But Abigail was there, standing just inside the glass with a cup of something warm in her hands. She saw the children. Her face went still and careful the way a person's face goes when they are trying not to cry in front of someone dangerous. Ruth looked at the doll in her arms. Then she let it fall. It was not clumsy. It was deliberate. She let it slip from her fingers without breaking her stride, and it landed in the dust near the edge of the boardwalk, just outside Abigail's door. Amos did not see it. He was watching Ben. Rosie started to turn back, but Ruth touched her arm. Just a small touch. Rosie looked at her sister and understood something without being told what it was. She faced forward again. They kept walking. Abigail opened her door before the doll had even stopped moving. She stepped down, picked it up, and held it against her chest. She watched the children disappear around the far corner behind Amos. Then she looked down at the doll. She felt the seam along the back. It had been opened and pressed shut again, the stitching loose and deliberate. She went inside. It took her less than a minute to open the seam with her sewing scissors. The note was folded small and tight, tucked in beside the stuffing, like something hidden by careful hands. Abigail smoothed it open on her work table and read it once. Then she read it again, slower. She was already putting on her shawl before she reached the end. Miss Lydia was at the schoolhouse arranging her testimony papers when Abigail arrived at a near run. Abigail pressed the note flat on the desk in front of her without a word. Miss Lydia read it, her lips pressed together. She set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Clara Wren told her to hide duplicate records," Abigail said. Margaret listened. "I know she did. She was not a careless woman." "No," Miss Lydia agreed. "She was not. But we looked everywhere. The sewing baskets, the flour bins, Ben's memory of the coat." Abigail shook her head. Where would she hide something she needed to survive, and that Amos would never think to touch? Miss Lydia stood very still. Her eyes moved slowly around the schoolroom, past the chalkboard, past the row of small desks, past the window where the morning light came in, low and gold. And then her eyes stopped. In the corner near the door, worn smooth from years of use, sat a small carved kneeling bench. It was plain and low, made from dark wood that did not quite match the rest of the schoolhouse floor. Margaret had brought it in herself, years before she died. She had prayed on it after deliveries, sometimes after hard days. The wood had come from the floorboards of her very first freight wagon, the one that had finally given out and been dismantled behind the barn. Miss Lydia said, "The truth is where your hands pray." Abigail looked at the bench, then at Miss Lydia. They moved together. Miss Lydia took the small iron poker from beside the stove. Abigail knelt beside the bench and ran her fingers along the underside. The wood was thick there, thicker than it needed to be, and there were shallow grooves near the base, where something had been fitted snugly and sealed with a strip of tacked leather. Abigail worked the leather free. Miss Lydia helped her ease the bottom panel loose. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed cord, were packets. Abigail untied the first one with shaking hands. Inside were ledger pages, written in Margaret's careful hand. Freight contracts with names and dates. Delivery records going back 4 years. Paid debt receipts, each one signed and stamped. Proof that Margaret Harper had not died in debt. Proof that the business was solvent and valuable, and rightfully her children's to inherit. Miss Lydia opened the second packet. Her breath caught. It was a signed agreement. Amos Harper's name was on it, along with the name of a rival freight company. He had already arranged to sell Margaret's routes. And beneath that, on a separate page, were the names of 2 distant families and the amounts paid as placement fees. One name beside Rosie, one name beside Ruth. Cash, in exchange for the girls, dressed up in careful language to look like charity. They had found it. All of it. Abigail stood up. Her hands were steady now, the way hands get when there is no more time for fear. "The hearing has already started," Miss Lydia said. Abigail tucked the oilcloth packets under her arm and held the door open. They ran. The town hall had never felt so small. Someone had pushed the long supper tables to the walls and set up a plain wooden chair behind the biggest table for the circuit judge. His name was Judge Harlan Cord, and he had the face of a man who had heard too many lies to be surprised by them, but had not yet stopped caring about the truth. He was gray at the temples, straight in his chair, and he looked at everyone in the room the same way, steady and patient, like a man waiting for the water to clear before he decided if it was safe to drink. The benches along the walls were filled. Most of Mercy Crossing had come, some out of concern for the children, some out of fear of Amos, some because they simply needed to see how a thing like this ended. Ben sat in the second row, with Rosie pressed against his left side and Ruth against his right. Abigail sat beside Ruth, with her shawl pulled close and her hands folded in her lap. She kept glancing toward the door. Miss Lydia had not arrived yet. At the front of the room, Amos Harper stood with his hat in his hands and his voice soft with sorrow. He was dressed well, dark coat, clean boots, hair combed neat. He looked like a man carrying a burden he had not asked for and was too honorable to put down. "Your Honor," he said, "I loved my brother. When he passed, I watched his wife Margaret work herself into the ground running that freight business alone. I tried to help. She was proud. That was her way." He paused and shook his head slowly. When she died, there was almost nothing left. Debts that her records could not cover. 3 children with no father, no income, and no home that could sustain them. I have done nothing but try to give those children a future. He turned and looked at the room with tired, patient eyes. Then a stranger rode into town, a man with no name worth trusting, no roots here, no right to involve himself in a family matter. He frightened my nephew into handing over a private document and used that boy's grief to make himself look like some kind of rescuer. He set his hat on the table and folded his hands. The Bible page Ben carried was incomplete. He did not understand what he was holding. He was coached. The room was quiet. Ben stared at the back of Amos's head and said nothing. His jaw was tight. Rosie leaned closer to him, and he put his arm around her shoulder. Then Thomas was brought in. 2 of Sheriff Pike's deputies walked him through the side door. Thomas moved carefully, one hand pressed against his ribs, where the reopened wound pulled with every breath. His shirt was clean, but his face was gray from smoke and pain and a night without sleep. He sat in the chair set out for him and looked at the judge without looking away. Judge Cord studied him for a long moment. Then he opened the hearing. Lyle Griggs was called first. He had cleaned himself up too. The gambler's calluses were hidden under a pair of thin gloves he kept folding and unfolding on his knee. He sat in the witness chair and told his story with a practiced kind of calm. He said Thomas had grabbed him by the collar before he could offer any blessing. He said Thomas had knocked a personal item from his pocket and then held it up to the room as if it were evidence of something sinful. He said he was a traveling man of faith, wrongly humiliated by a violent stranger who had no business in Mercy Crossing. "I never raised a hand," Griggs said, his voice smooth as creek water over flat rock. "That man did." Two of Amos's hired witnesses nodded from the benches without being asked. Then came the men who claimed to have seen Thomas near the freight barn the night of the fire. They were vague in the way that paid witnesses are vague. They had seen someone. The build looked right. The bedroll was his. They could not say for certain, but they were fairly sure. Sheriff Pike was called. He stood at the front of the room with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly. Judge Cord asked him directly whether Thomas had been formally identified at the fire scene, or whether the evidence had been circumstantial. Pike opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "The bedroll was found near the barn. That is what I can confirm." "And the identification of Mr. Wren himself?" Pike looked at the floor. "It was dark, Your Honor." The judge made a note. He looked at Amos's table, then at Thomas, then out at the room. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a man sorting what he was certain of from what he was being asked to assume. Ben watched the judge's face and felt the cold creeping in. He had believed that the truth would be enough. He had believed that once someone with authority sat down and listened, the lies would fall apart on their own. But the lies were not falling apart. They were standing up straight in clean clothes, with calm voices, and the truth was sitting pale and wounded in a chair with no papers and no witnesses who had yet found the courage to speak clearly. Rosie tugged his sleeve. He looked down at her. Her eyes were wide and scared. "Is it going wrong?" she whispered. Ben looked back at the front of the room, at Amos, patient and polished, at Thomas, still and quiet under the weight of accusation, at Sheriff Pike staring at his hat. He pulled Rosie close and did not answer, because he did not know. The side door opened. Everyone turned. Abigail Bell walked in with her chin up and her arms full. She carried a bundle of oilcloth packets pressed against her chest like something precious. Her dress was dusty from moving fast, and her hair had come loose on one side, but her eyes were steady. She walked straight to the judge's table and set the packets down in front of him. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Abigail Bell. I am a seamstress in this town, and I have lived here for 11 years. I was present when Margaret Harper wrote down the names of her children and their inheritance. I signed my name as a witness to that record." She paused. "So did Clara Wren." Judge Cord looked at the packets and then at Abigail. "You may be seated, Mrs. Bell." "I would rather stand, sir." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "I am not here to argue law," Abigail continued. "I am here to tell you what I saw with my own eyes and what my name stands behind. Margaret Harper was not a woman who died in ruin. She was a woman who worked hard, kept honest records, and loved her children enough to protect them on paper before she ever got sick." She opened the top oilcloth packet and turned it toward the judge. "These are her freight ledgers. These are paid debt receipts. These are ownership documents for her wagons and her routes. And this," she said, lifting one folded page carefully, "is a signed agreement showing that Amos Harper had already arranged to sell Margaret's freight routes to a rival company and to place the twins separately with families who were each to receive a cash fee." The room went still. Amos's jaw tightened. He said something to his lawyer in a low voice. Miss Lydia Crane stepped forward from beside the door. She had come in just behind Abigail and had been waiting quietly. She spoke clearly, the way she always did when she wanted children to understand something important. I taught Ben Harper in my schoolhouse, she said. His mother came to speak with me twice about her children's future. Margaret Harper told me plainly, both times, that she wanted all three of her children raised together. Not separated, not placed out, together. She set a second bundle of papers beside Abigail's. These are the duplicate freight contracts. Every route Margaret ran is accounted for. The business was not drowning. It was being strangled. The judge picked up one of the ledger pages and read it quietly. Then the room began to move. An elderly woman near the back stood up slowly, holding the edge of the bench to steady herself. Her voice was thin, but she did not waver. "My husband needed that medicine for 3 months," she said. "Amos Harper told me the delivery was lost in transit. I watched my husband suffer waiting on it." A farmer, 2 rows behind her, stood up next. "Same story with my seed grain. He told me Margaret's business had failed, and the goods were never coming. I nearly lost my spring planting." Gideon Pratt rose from his seat near the wall. He was not a man who enjoyed speaking in front of crowds, and it showed in the way he held his hat with both hands. But his voice was firm. "I run the livery," he said. "I have known gamblers my whole working life. Lyle Griggs has come through this territory at least twice that I can count. He is a card sharp. Those marks on his deck are his own work. He is no more a preacher than my barn cat." A low murmur ran through the room. Then Sheriff Calder Pike stood up. He did not look at Amos. He looked at the judge, and his face carried the particular weight of a man putting down something he had been carrying too long. "I owe Amos Harper a debt from a cattle deal gone bad," he said. "He used that debt to keep me quiet. He told me what to sign and when to look the other way." His voice steadied. "Thomas Wren did not set that fire. I know it because I saw the burn pattern myself, and because Thomas went into that barn and freed those horses at cost to himself. A man who set the fire does not go back in to save what is burning." The room was silent. Judge Cord set down the ledger page. He folded his hands on the table and turned his eyes to Thomas. "Mr. Wren," he said quietly, "you have been accused of desertion from military service. I will hear your answer now." Thomas stood up slowly. His side hurt where the old wound had torn open again. He could feel it pulling with every breath, a tight and burning ache beneath his ribs. He kept his face calm. He had learned a long time ago how to stand straight when something inside was broken. The whole room watched him. He did not look at Amos. He looked at the judge. "I was listed missing after a retreat near the end of the war," Thomas said. "The line broke. Officers left the field without accounting for the men behind them. I did not run." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There were 2 boys from our company lying wounded in a ditch. Couldn't walk. Couldn't move themselves. And there was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, who had wandered in from somewhere nearby. She was sitting between them, like she thought they could protect her." The room was very quiet. "I carried the girl first, came back for the boys, moved all 3 of them to a farmhouse, about a quarter-mile back from the fighting." He stopped and looked down at his boots for just a moment, then back up. "By the time I returned to report, my unit was gone. The report listed me missing, and then absent. Somebody later added the word deserter, because the paperwork was easier than the truth." He let out a slow breath. "I was cleared, eventually. A commander found the record and corrected it. But by then my wife was gone. Fever took her while I was still trying to find my way home." His voice did not break, but it came close. "After that, I did not much care what the world believed about me." He sat back down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then a sound came from the far corner of the room, a chair scraping back, slow and deliberate. An old man rose to his feet. He was heavy-set, with white hair and a soldier's posture that age had not entirely taken from him. He wore no uniform, but he carried himself like a man who had once known exactly what duty felt like. "Sergeant Earl Pruitt," he said, addressing the judge. "Retired. I served in the same theater as Thomas Wren." His voice was rough but steady. "I know this man. I also know the farmhouse he is talking about because I was the one who found those two boys and that little girl alive inside it." He looked at Thomas directly. "The correction to his record came through my testimony. I am the commander who filed it." He sat back down without another word. The judge looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then he looked at his papers. Then he looked across the room to where Ben stood with his arms around Rosie and Ruth. "Ben Harper," the judge said. "Come forward, son." Ben walked up slowly. Rosie and Ruth held his hands on either side, and he did not let go of them, even when he stopped in front of the judge's table. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Where do you and your sisters wish to live while your inheritance is being protected?" Ben swallowed. He glanced back at Thomas once. Then he faced the judge and spoke clearly. "I want my sisters kept with me, sir. All three of us, together. That is what Mama wanted." He took a breath. "I want my mother's freight line running again, the way she ran it. Honest." He paused. "And I want Thomas Wren allowed to stay, because he was the only grown man who heard me crying behind that store and came back with me. That is all." Rosie pressed her face against Ben's arm. Ruth stood perfectly still, watching the judge. The judge sat back. He picked up his pen. "Amos Harper is hereby stripped of guardianship over these children," he said. "The Harper estate, including the wagon freight business, the freight teams, the routes, and the ranch property, is restored in full to Ben, Rosie, and Ruth Harper as their rightful inheritance." He wrote as he spoke, and his pen moved with purpose. "Amos Harper and Lyle Griggs are to be taken into custody immediately on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful attempted transfer of minors." He set the pen down. "Thomas Wren is appointed manager of the Harper Ranch and freight line on behalf of the children until Ben Harper comes of age." He looked at Abigail, then Miss Lydia, then Sheriff Pike in turn. "Abigail Bell, Lydia Crane, and Sheriff Calder Pike will serve as trustees overseeing the estate. Sheriff Pike, your first duty in that role is to deliver these children safely to their ranch before nightfall." Pike stood straight. "Yes, Your Honor." Two men moved toward Amos. He did not go quietly. He said things Thomas chose not to repeat later when the children asked what happened. But he went. Lyle Griggs went faster, looking mostly relieved that his part was finished. The room exhaled all at once. Rosie let go of Ben's hand and ran straight to Thomas. She wrapped both arms around his leg and pressed her face against his knee. He reached down and rested his hand on the back of her head. Ruth walked to him more slowly. She held out her doll with both hands. Inside it, folded small, was her mother's last note. Thomas took the doll carefully and held it like it was something that mattered, because it was. Ben stood a step behind his sisters and watched Thomas with tired, grateful eyes that belonged on a much older face. Thomas knelt down, even though it hurt, so he could look at all three of them at the same level. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go home." The weeks that followed were full of work and noise and small, ordinary things that felt extraordinary after everything that had happened. The burned freight barn was rebuilt with timber. Gideon sourced, and Hans, the town, volunteered. The Harper wagons were cleaned of Amos's paint and repaired properly. Miss Lydia organized the school books Margaret had ordered and opened a small fund from the recovered freight profits to keep the classroom running through winter. Sheriff Pike repaid his debts publicly, one by one, and became a quieter and more careful man because of it. Not perfect, but better. Abigail sewed curtains for the ranch house windows and taught Rosie how to hem a straight line. Ruth helped her, without being asked, threading needles with a patience that made Abigail smile every time. Thomas repaired the porch boards, built a proper gate, and spent long evenings teaching Ben how to handle the freight teams on the road. Ben learned fast. He had been watching his mother do it his whole life, and it showed. The twins planted sunflowers along the south fence. Ruth pressed Clara's old tin button into the soil near the first one, her lips moving quietly, the way they did when she was thinking hard about something important. On a bright Sunday morning, the whole town gathered at the road in front of the ranch. The Harper wagon stood freshly painted, in clean dark red with yellow lettering along the side. Harper Family Freight. Ben, Rosie, and Ruth, proprietors. People brought food. Someone played a fiddle. Rosie danced with Abigail in the grass and laughed the way children laugh when they have been safe long enough to forget they were ever afraid. Ben stood beside Thomas near the wagon. He watched his sisters for a moment, and then he looked up. "Do you think Mama knows?" he asked. "And Clara? Do you think they know we are all right?" Thomas looked out across the yard. The sunflowers had already grown taller than Ruth. Rosie was spinning in circles with her arms out wide, and Ruth was watching her twin and smiling that quiet, steady smile of hers. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I reckon," he said, "some promises take the long road home. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day."